we've got to teach them, and not as in being the teacher out the front, but a lot of time it's alongside them, working with them. We've got to teach them about those processes. The end result, you know, that's what we want, the end result, but a lot of it is about the processes, the steps we take to do that, and how, what is it that makes us who we are, and how we move through that. We've got to be thinking about those kind of things and how we do that with children. And I work on the thing that for a few years now I've been working on a thing in my mind, and in this job that I've taken now, I work around 3 words: communication, connection and contact. So what is it in how we make contact with children? When are those times? What do we do to make that contact? How do we connect? What is it about that we're connecting with them? You know, is there physical things that we're connecting with? And what is the communication that we use to make these contact and these connections? And I think if we're always looking at those kind of words, it can help us to move through, you know, our life with children. And then we also look at things like, so the workers that I'm working with now are called, they're people in the communities where I'm working, and I work with them around these 3 words, to what is the connections and the contact and the communication between the children, the families, the community and the school and the people in the schools. And this, I've taken this from my work with early childhood, with children's services and that, and you know, it applies the same through our life, I think. And it's about people, places, things and occasions as well. And so we can use,
Keep going.
we can use this. So it's, again, so if we're thinking about people, who are the people we make contact with? How often is that contact? You know, what is it about? You know, how do we connect? Is it that we're connecting through a phone? Is it that we're connecting through a physical place that we're going to? And what is the communications we're using, you know? And so what I'm doing in this job now is I'm using this as our framework, I guess, to work with when things are working really well. You know, we can see why is it working well? Is it that we've really thought about the people that are involved in this discussion or this work, and we're having these meetings at this place where people feel okay to connect and to sit down and talk. So they're the kind of things that I'm using, and I use this also, you know, like in my personal life with family and that as well. And I think that's a important part of our work in what I've learned, because when I first started studying, my favourite topic was the communication, you know, the human relations, basic human relation and communication, because I needed to know how to talk and how to grow, because I was scared, you know. I wasn't used to thinking for myself or saying what I want to say. And when you go and study, you learn about that, you know, that you have to step out of that comfort zone. And that's what we've got to help our little children do, you know. And if we can work with our little children from an early age, you know, from babies, whatever, we need to help them work through processes. And I think that's one of our biggest things for Aboriginal children, is we've got to work with our adults to help them to know how to work with their little children through issues. You know, there's so many issues. Young people that are able to work with others and inspire others to move in a different direction. You know, we need to be the change advocates, and that's what I think, you know, my leadership, you know, which is, you know, I've been sort of just gently nudged, you know, in ways, you know, and we need to then help our mob to be those change advocates as well, but we need to give them, and if we can do it with those little children at the beginning, you know, so we need to know how to do it and then to work with our little children to do it so that they can change. Like, it's a bit scary, you know, it's not always going to work this one way.
One of the things that's really concerned me over my professional life is the tendency for early childhood educators not to identify with the concept of leadership. And this really provoked some interest in my own research as to why this was happening and what kind of resources might be available to help us move leadership discourses forward for the field and to build a stronger leadership understanding across the field. One of the things that really helped me think about leadership was the work of Jill Blackmore. Jill was researching leadership in primary schools and high schools in particular, but I found some of the research findings from her work really applicable to the early childhood context. In particular, she was talking about how women in senior positions in schools tended to take on the emotional and relationship dimensions of leadership. And of course these were the ones that had lower status in the leadership hierarchy, whereas men tended to take on the money management and the high profile events. And she theorised some of this as emotional labour. And I've found that a really helpful concept to think about the work that women do across early childhood education and how a lot of that work is emotional labour. Giving it the term labour then dignifies it as work and not as some kind of thing you do because you're a woman, and enables us to develop a more robust kind of theory around that kind of work that is done. So I think it was an enormous contribution that she made. Moving on from that, she then theorised leadership in ways that were quite different to how it was being theorised in educational leadership in general. And I think my favourite quote from Jill around leadership that has really helped me think through the work of early childhood educators is leadership as everyday practice. As I worked with the concept of leadership as everyday practice, I began to see how it could really help mobilise a different kind of discourse. That leadership in the field had been primarily conceptualised as management, but also as something exceptional. And this view hasn't been helped in recent times by studies of high-profile people trying to draw lessons from their experiences as to what makes a good leader. It's the wrong way round, it's back to front. And leadership as everyday practice helps us think about looking in daily practice to see what are those activities, what are those experiences, what are those relationships that people are engaged in that actually make a difference, because that's what leadership is. It's working in a variety of ways to make a difference. The work of Judith Sachs has complemented that kind of theorisation for me. Judith talks about activism and about alliance building. So building alliances across difference, across different professions, across different discourses is a way of building leadership capacity. I just want to move back now to why I think and what the research seems to say about why early childhood people have been so reluctant to take on the mantle or the discourses of leadership. And I've alluded to some of those, particularly the kind of managerial discourses. But I think this notion of exceptionality is one of those things too. Two constructions of leadership that I've found really helpful in my work with practitioners, both in Australia and Chile, have been the concepts of pedagogical leadership and community leadership. These are perhaps artificial distinctions, but they're useful in helping to think through the different kinds of leadership activities that people undertake. Our definition of pedagogical leadership that we've worked with in the Chile project that I think is very relevant is the curriculum decision making. It focuses on curriculum decision making that's taken in conjunction with children and with colleagues to move the curriculum forward, to engage children and colleagues in the Curriculum Act and to be reflective. about curriculum decision making. So that's where we see pedagogical leadership, and I've been working with some colleagues to theorise leadership with children in early childhood settings. We've started to work with the concept of distributed leadership. For me, not a very satisfying concept, but a good place to start to capture the richness of the engagement that takes place in co-construction, in that curriculum moment when adult and children are exploring, hypothesising, reasoning, explaining and reflecting on their learning. And I've found that quite a useful way of thinking about when the child takes the lead into this activity. In regards to community leadership, I see communities as having multiple definitions and multiple understandings. So, for example, there's the community of educators, there's a community of children, there's the community, which is that kind of neighbourhood concept of what happens kind of out there. And then, of course, there is the family, which is their community too. That they help form the community of an early childhood program. So implied in the term community leadership is the expectation that educators, early years educators, will actually take the initiative to engage other communities in the early childhood endeavour. And that seems to work very powerfully with the idea that the Early Childhood Centre has the potential to be the hub of learning communities, the hub of community building. That's a place where all kinds of people can come together to learn about how to live together, in fact. So those two concepts are not fully theorised in my head of community and pedagogical leadership, but I think they're helpful in naming some of the activities that we do. And naming things helps us understand them. Even if the name isn't quite right, then we can think up a better name as we talk more, research our own practice, and document what it is we do and how it is that we think. The concept of communities of practice has been a very powerful one to insert into our conceptualisations of pedagogical leadership and community leadership, and one that's been quite readily taken up, I think, in the field. That idea that people come together when they have a shared interest to learn from each other, to exchange their knowledge and their perspectives, and to build new knowledge together in some kind of community of meaning. So that has really contributed to the concept of pedagogical and community leadership. But I have to say that I think Australia is actually ahead of the game in some of this theorising around leadership. People will know the work of Pen Green, I'm sure, and its work around leadership and what they call leadership fullness. And they have a very elaborate conceptualisation of it. But that conceptualisation has been developed in a very different context to that of Australia, in a context where there was an enormous government focus on the expenditure of money to fund a huge rollout of children's services, and it reflects a very different structure of children's services. So we have to invent our own. And those American researchers have really helped me think about how you build leadership across a field, not just in individual sites of practice. And that's something I think we have to undertake more research in Australia so that we can more fully understand the diversity of contexts in which people are working, so that we can build some kind of leadership discourse that is inclusive but also responsive to individual contexts. This idea of dark knowledges in communities that I've just begun to think about, I think is a really important one, because there are lots of experiences that children have and lots of knowledge that families and communities have, that are dark, and the way that becomes incorporated in the curriculum is a challenge to those exercising leadership in the curriculum. So I think knowing about that and being prepared to take that on board is one of the challenges of pedagogical leadership. And of course, sharing that knowledge back with the community is also a big challenge. There are many documented cases now, documented research case studies, I guess, of people who've tried innovative practices, who've been involved in inclusive and equity programs, to find that they've had to defend those stances in their communities, in their broader communities. And that's a skill that really is not an easy one for the field to develop, and probably not very well addressed in pre-service teacher education either. So the challenges for pedagogical leadership then are how to incorporate those dark experiences, how to acknowledge them, and what to do with them in the curriculum, because I'm sure that they're lurking there in every early childhood program, and very often they're silenced or marginalised. And what are the implications of that kind of marginalisation and silencing for the children who are actually experiencing them? So that comes back to that really important issue around what are the dominant discourses that are privileged and that are celebrated in your day-to-day practice as an early years educator, and those ethical questions about who gets to decide just which ones are included and which ones aren't.
The theory I'd like to talk about is in relation to leadership and the construction of leadership, and specifically around notions of critical leadership. I've chosen to talk about critical leadership given what I believe is the importance of unpacking the identity of leaders when we talk about the act of leadership, rather than merely just talking about leadership itself. Critical leaders and leadership theorists pay attention to the way in which leaders construct their own identity, and they explore issues such as the politics of power. They explore issues such as notions of self, the dark side of their own leadership, and the ways in which leadership is understood not just from their own perspective but from followers as well. I have a vested interest in understanding the ways in which critical leadership theory is practiced in early childhood, given my concern that often we position leadership in early childhood as a good act, rather than actually exploring some of the tensions that exist within the process of leading oneself and others. In thinking about critical leadership, I'd like to perhaps just start with a quote from Carl Weeks, who says that certainty is insensitive to change, but it restores that sensitivity. Carl Weeks suggests to us that we need to move from a place of knowingness around leadership and explore some of the tensions that may exist. He spends quite a lot of time challenging people to unpack their own identity and the way in which they locate themselves, and challenges people to move from leadership as a noun to a verb. Another point about critical leadership, again, is derived from some concerns by theorists who locate themselves in that space, is that too often leadership is seen as benign, producing goods, and leaders themselves having an extensive sense of knowingness and leading people in the right direction. Rather, it's the insecurities, the tensions, and some of the uncertainties that critical leadership theorists actually attempt to unpack. They pay attention to issues such as whiteness, power relations, culture, gender and sexuality, and in doing so disrupt many of the traditions of how we understand leadership, i.e. an able-bodied white male who leads a team of unknowing followers into light and goodness. What critical leaders actually say is, perhaps we need to spend less time focusing on the act of leadership, that is the follower, and what is produced out of that, and more time deconstructing unpacking and trying to trouble that entire notion of I'm trying to lead someone, perhaps we should spend more time saying, is leadership a good thing? How is it constructed? Who am I leading and where am I trying to lead them to? The early years learning framework suggests that early childhood programs embody and embrace the notion of pedagogical leadership. And this has caused me to stop and reflect on two particular words, that is the notion of pedagogy and the notion of leadership. And the troublesome way when you link those two words together, that is pedagogical leadership, the questions that arise for me is, who is the leader? Which voices are actually heard within our programs? Which theories are privileged and which ones are not? And what does it actually mean to lead pedagogy, or are we talking about leading individuals? Each one of those concepts raises more questions again around your own identity, what you believe in as a leader, as a pedagogical leader, and which pedagogies are you trying to surface and which ones are you trying to shut down. I would suggest that perhaps instead of talking about pedagogical leadership, we spend more time talking about one's own identity and how one comes to understand who they are, and that they locate themselves both within their own politic but broader social issues. I'm really attracted to some of the work of Amanda Sinclair that says we are never linear, we are never one, and in fact we are a parliament of ourselves. That is, as early childhood educators, we are located both as in a space of education, within our families, within our communities, and that there are many times that those tensions and the politics between our own identity, that is our religion, our sexuality, our role as educator, create some tensions and fractures in our own ways of being and doing. And Amanda Sinclair challenges us to locate those times when we dip in and out of our identity, and says to us that perhaps we are more multiple than we are singular, and exploring that multiplicity both in our lives and the lives of young children can bring strength to our work. It's that uncertainty that we are trying to achieve rather than a sense of certainty in locating who we are as educators and leaders.